Black teen saves billionaire's daughter from drowning. What he asks for in return makes her father break down. The broken streetlight outside Marcus Johnson's window flickered like a dying star, casting intermittent shadows across the cramped bedroom he shared with his younger brother Derek. At 15, Marcus had already mastered the art of silent movement, carefully stepping over the creaky floorboard as he prepared for his morning paper route. The ancient alarm clock showed 4:30 a.m., another day beginning in the darkness. Their apartment sat in a forgotten corner of downtown Atlanta, where dreams came to rest among the graffiti-covered walls and chain-link fences. But inside their modest home, Marcus's mother, Gloria Johnson, had created a sanctuary of hope and determination. The walls might have been thin, the furniture second-hand, but every surface gleamed with care. And educational certificates, hers and her son's, hung proudly in dollar store frames. Gloria worked as a night janitor in the towering office buildings that pierced Atlanta's skyline, her shadow moving through empty corridors while the city slept. During the day, she took classes at the community college, pursuing a degree in healthcare administration one painstaking credit at a time. She was the living embodiment of the phrase, "lead by example," showing her sons that circumstances were challenges to overcome, not excuses to accept. Marcus inherited his mother's quiet determination and unflagging work ethic. Beyond his paper route, he worked weekends at Chen's grocery, where Mr. Chen had taken a liking to the serious young man who could calculate complex discounts in his head faster than the ancient cash register. Between school, work, and helping care for Derek, Marcus's life was a carefully choreographed dance of responsibilities. Yet he never complained. His friends at school sometimes teased him for his worn clothes and ancient flip phone, but Marcus wore his poverty like a well-fitted suit, with dignity and without shame. He understood that temporary circumstances didn't define permanent worth, a lesson his mother had woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Across town, in a world that might as well have been another planet, the Richardson family occupied the top 2 floors of the prestigious Sovereign building. Thomas Richardson's journey from middle-class obscurity to billionaire status was the stuff of business school case studies. His financial innovation platform, Richardson Global Investments, had revolutionized international banking, earning him both fortune and influence. His daughter, Sophie Richardson, attended Oakwood Academy, where tuition costs exceeded what most families in Marcus's neighborhood earned in a year. At 13, she was already fluent in 3 languages and had traveled to more countries than most people visit in a lifetime. Yet beneath her privileged exterior lay a growing awareness of her bubble, a nagging sense that the world was larger and more complex than her carefully curated environment suggested. The paths of these 2 young people, Marcus Johnson and Sophie Richardson, should never have crossed. Their Atlanta existed in parallel dimensions, one of struggle and dignity, the other of privilege and possibility. But fate, with its peculiar sense of timing, had other plans. The morning that would rewrite both their stories dawned cold and foggy, unusual for Atlanta in early spring. Marcus had finished his paper route in record time, thanks to a new shortcut he discovered through Piedmont Park. The fog hung thick over the park's lake, transforming the familiar landscape into something almost magical. He checked his watch, 6:45 a.m. If he hurried, he could still make it to school early enough to help Miss Rodriguez set up the science lab. The aging teacher had been struggling with arthritis lately, and Marcus had quietly appointed himself her unofficial assistant. The park was quietly alive at this hour. Dedicated joggers in expensive athletic wear ghosted through the mist, their breathing creating small clouds in the cold air. A few dog walkers wandered the paths, their pets' leashes disappearing into the fog like threads into cotton wool. Marcus was cutting across the wooden dock that extended over the lake when he heard it. A sharp crack, followed by a splash and a scream that turned his blood to ice. Through the fog, he saw ripples spreading from a point near the dock's edge, and then a flash of pale blue, a coat, before it disappeared beneath the surface. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously. Later, he would remember everything in vivid snapshots. His backpack hitting the dock's wooden planks, his shoes flying off, the shock of the cold water as he dove in. The lake, still carrying winter's chill, hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. The fog made everything disorienting. Sound traveled strangely over water, and the screams seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But Marcus had spent countless summer hours in the community pool, where free swim lessons had been one of the few luxuries his mother insisted upon. In this world, she'd said, you never know when knowing how to swim might save a life. He broke the surface, spotted movement about 20 feet away, and started swimming with strong, purposeful strokes. The figure he'd seen was a girl, probably a few years younger than him, thrashing in panic. Her expensive-looking coat was now a deadly weight, dragging her down. A designer backpack floated nearby, the likely cause of whatever had brought her to the water's edge. "Stop fighting," Marcus called out, his voice steady despite the cold. "I'm coming to help you. Just try to float." The girl's terrified eyes found his, and something in his calm demeanor seemed to reach her. Her thrashing subsided slightly, though he could see she was struggling to keep her head above water. Marcus reached her side, immediately shifting into the rescue position he'd learned in those summer classes. "I've got you," he said firmly. "Put your arms around my shoulders. Don't grab my neck. That's it. We're going to swim to the shore together." The journey back felt endless. The girl was small, but her waterlogged clothes made her dense as lead. Marcus's muscles screamed in protest against the cold and exertion. He was distantly aware of voices on the shore, of phones being held up to record the scene, of someone shouting about calling 911. When they finally reached the shallow water, Marcus didn't stop until they were completely clear of the lake. The girl collapsed onto the grass, coughing and shivering. He immediately checked her breathing and pulse, just as he'd been taught. Her lips were blue with cold, but her pulse was strong. "Someone get blankets," he shouted to the growing crowd of onlookers. A jogger stripped off her expensive running jacket and handed it over. Marcus wrapped it around the girl's shoulders, noting absently that it probably cost more than his entire wardrobe. Thank you," the girl managed between chattering teeth. I thought I was going to." "You're safe now," Marcus assured her, his own body beginning to shake with delayed reaction and cold. "Help is coming. What's your name?" "Sophie," she whispered. "Sophie Richardson." The name meant nothing to Marcus at that moment. He was focused on keeping her warm and calm until the paramedics arrived. But in the growing crowd, phones were already buzzing with recognition. Sophie Richardson, only daughter of Thomas Richardson, one of Atlanta's most powerful men. The sound of sirens cut through the fog, just as a fleet of black SUVs came screaming into the park. Security personnel in dark suits emerged, moving with practiced efficiency to secure the area. Behind them came Thomas Richardson himself, his usual composed demeanor shattered by fear. "Sophie," he called out, running toward them with no regard for his $1,000 shoes sinking into the wet grass. "Daddy?" Sophie tried to stand but swayed unsteadily. Marcus supported her automatically, then found himself face to face with one of the most influential men in Atlanta. Richardson gathered his daughter into his arms, his face ashen. Over Sophie's shoulder, his eyes met Marcus's. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of how quickly the boundaries between their separate worlds could dissolve. "You saved her," Richardson said, his voice rough with emotion. "You saved my daughter." Marcus, suddenly very aware of his dripping clothes and bare feet, shifted uncomfortably. "Anyone would have done the same, sir." Richardson's gaze swept the crowd, the people still holding up phones, the joggers who had stopped to watch but not help, the dog walkers keeping their careful distance. "No," he said quietly. "They wouldn't have, and they didn't." The paramedics arrived then, and Marcus found himself wrapped in an emergency blanket and guided toward an ambulance. As they checked him over, he watched Sophie being attended to by what appeared to be a private medical team. Her father hadn't left her side, but his gaze kept returning to Marcus, thoughtful and intense. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, already calculating how late this would make him for school, whether his textbooks had survived the water, if Mr. Chen would let him make up his Saturday morning shift. The weight of everyday responsibilities was already settling back onto his shoulders. He couldn't have known then how this morning would change everything. Not just for him and Sophie, but for their families, their schools, and eventually their entire community. As the fog began to lift over Piedmont Park, the rigid boundaries between their two Atlantas were already beginning to blur, setting in motion changes that would ripple out far beyond that cold spring morning. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of activity that left Marcus feeling increasingly disconnected from his normal routine. After being cleared by the paramedics, he'd borrowed a phone to call his mother, his voice steady as he explained why he wouldn't be at school. Gloria Johnson had left her night shift job early, arriving at the park with the speed and determination of a mother protecting her child. What she found was a scene that seemed pulled from a movie. Security personnel establishing perimeters, news vans beginning to arrive, and her son, wrapped in an emergency blanket, sitting calmly at the center of it all. "Baby, are you okay?" she asked, pulling him into a fierce embrace despite his wet clothes. "I'm fine, Mama," Marcus assured her. Just cold. Before Gloria could respond, a man in an impeccable suit approached them. Despite his obvious wealth and power, something in his expression made her hold her protective stance. Thomas Richardson recognized the look. He'd seen it in his own mirror whenever Sophie was threatened. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice carefully modulated. "Your son is a hero. He saved my daughter's life without a moment's hesitation. I've seen the security footage." He paused, emotion briefly overtaking his practiced composure. He didn't even take off his jacket before jumping in. Gloria's arm tightened around Marcus's shoulders. "That's how I raised him," she said simply. The conversation that followed would later seem surreal to Marcus. Richardson insisted on sending them home in one of his cars, with a promise to replace Marcus's waterlogged school supplies and lost shoes. Gloria tried to decline, but Richardson was politely adamant. "Please," he said quietly, "it's the least I can do." As they rode home in the leather-seated luxury car, Gloria held her son's hand tightly. "You did good," she whispered. "Your daddy would be proud." Marcus squeezed her hand back, thinking of the father he barely remembered, lost to gun violence when Marcus was just 6. The familiar ache of that loss mixed with a new feeling he couldn't quite identify. The revelations weren't finished. By that evening, the story had exploded across social media. Shaky phone videos showed Marcus's dive into the lake, his steady swim to Sophie, the professional way he'd handled the rescue. Local news stations were already calling it the Piedmont Park miracle. But it was the security footage from the park's cameras that truly captured public attention. The clear, high-quality video showed every detail. Sophie reaching for her fallen backpack, the rotted board giving way, Marcus's instant response. There was no hesitation, no calculation, just pure instinct to help someone in need. When the footage reached Richardson Global Investments board members, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just about a rescue. It was about character, about the kind of split-second decisions that revealed a person's true nature. Thomas Richardson, watching the video for the 20th time in his office, felt something crystallize in his mind. Meanwhile, in their small apartment, Marcus tried to process the day's events while helping Derek with his homework. His phone, temporarily replaced by one of Richardson's assistants, kept buzzing with messages from classmates and local reporters. "Are you going to be rich now?" Derek asked, eyes wide with childish hope. Marcus ruffled his brother's hair. "It's not about money, D. I just did what needed doing." But money, and its power to change lives, was very much on Thomas Richardson's mind as he sat in his home office that night. Sophie, finally warm and resting after the ordeal, had told him something that struck deep. "He didn't even know who I was, Dad," she'd said. "He just helped, and then he made sure I was okay before he even thought about himself. But his shoes, Dad, they were already so worn, and now they're ruined because of me." Richardson had seen those shoes, noted the careful way they'd been maintained despite their age. He'd recognized the signs of poverty, worn with dignity, something he remembered from his own childhood before his business success changed everything. The next morning, as Marcus prepared to return to school, a sleek black car appeared outside his building. The driver carried an envelope containing an invitation. Thomas Richardson wanted to meet with Marcus and his mother that afternoon. "It's important." The note read in Richardson's precise handwriting. "There's something I need to discuss with both of you." Gloria took the afternoon off from her classes, her face tight with concern. Marcus sat beside her in the elevator of the Richardson Global Investments building, both of them silent as they rose to the top floor. The view of Atlanta spread out before them, a patchwork of prosperity and poverty that had never been more apparent. Richardson met them himself. No secretaries or assistants present. Sophie was there too, still pale but smiling shyly at Marcus. She'd changed out of her usual designer clothes into something simpler, though Marcus suspected even her simple outfit cost more than his entire wardrobe. "Thank you for coming," Richardson began, gesturing them to comfortable chairs. "I've been thinking about how to express my gratitude for what you did, Marcus. But before I make any offers, I want to understand something." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Tell me about your school." The question seemed to surprise everyone in the room, but Marcus, after a moment's hesitation, began to speak. He told them about the dedicated teachers working with outdated materials, about students sharing textbooks, about the computer lab where half the machines didn't work. He described the talent he saw every day, brilliant minds limited not by ability, but by resources. As he spoke, Richardson watched Sophie's face. His daughter's expression showed not pity, but growing anger at the inequities Marcus described. It was a look he recognized, the same one he'd worn as a young man, determined to change his circumstances. "I see," Richardson said finally. "And now I know I want to offer you, Marcus. But first, I need you to understand something." He stood, walking to the window. "What you did yesterday, saving Sophie, that wasn't just about swimming or quick thinking, it was about character. The kind of character this world desperately needs more of." He turned back to face them. "So I'm prepared to offer you anything you want, a college fund, a new home for your family. Both, name it, and it's yours." The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. Gloria reached for Marcus's hand, but her son was already sitting straighter in his chair, his mind working through something. "Sir," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Before I answer, could I ask you something about your company's community investment programs?" Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Go ahead." What followed would change not just Marcus's life but the lives of thousands of students across Atlanta. But that was still to come. For now, in that sunlit office high above the city, a 15-year-old boy was about to prove that heroism comes in many forms. And sometimes the bravest act is asking not for yourself, but for others. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of opportunity and responsibility settling on his shoulders. In his mind, he saw the faces of his classmates, heard Miss Rodriguez's quiet sighs over broken lab equipment, remembered the community center where he'd learned to swim now struggling to keep its doors open. "I don't want anything for myself," he said finally, his voice growing stronger with each word. "But I want to propose something bigger." He glanced at his mother, drawing strength from her presence. "I want you to adopt my school district." The silence that followed was profound. Sophie straightened in her chair, her eyes widening. Gloria's hand tightened on her son's arm, though whether in warning or support wasn't clear. Richardson's expression remained carefully neutral. "Explain what you mean by adopt," Richardson said after a moment. Marcus leaned forward, words flowing now with passionate intensity. "Not just money, though we need that too. I mean real investment. Computers that actually work. Up-to-date textbooks, a proper science lab, teaching tools that aren't decades old. But more than that, internship programs, mentorship opportunities, connections to the business world." He gestured to the window, to the city spread out below. "There are kids in my school who are brilliant at coding but have never touched a new computer. Future engineers sharing one broken calculator. Scientists working with chemicals that expired before they were born. It's not just about resources, it's about showing them that someone believes in their potential." Richardson had moved to his desk, making notes as Marcus spoke. "You understand what you're asking for? This would be a multi-million-dollar commitment." "Yes, sir." Marcus met his gaze steadily. "But you asked what I wanted. You have the power to change not just one life, but thousands. And isn't that a better investment? And you want nothing for yourself?" Richardson pressed. "No personal reward?" Marcus smiled slightly. "Getting to see those changes happen would be reward enough." As they would later learn, this was the answer that sealed the deal. Richardson had been prepared for requests for money, for opportunities, for connections. But this response, this vision of systemic change, resonated with something deep in his own history. The immediate consequences of Marcus's decision rippled out like waves from a stone dropped in still water. By that evening, Richardson's legal team was already drafting preliminary proposals. Education consultants were being contacted, and word was beginning to spread through both Atlanta's business community and its educational system. The reactions were as varied as they were intense. Some of Marcus's classmates hailed him as a hero twice over, first for the rescue, now for this. Others muttered about missed opportunities, about how he should have asked for something for himself, his family. At Oakwood Academy, Sophie found herself navigating new waters as well. Some of her classmates' parents were Richardson Global Investments shareholders, and not all were pleased with this new initiative. She overheard conversations about wasted resources and misplaced priorities. But it was at home that the most significant changes were happening. Gloria sat with Marcus late that night after Derek had gone to bed. "I'm proud of you," she said softly. "But I need to know, are you sure about this? He was offering to change our lives." Marcus looked at their small living room, at the carefully mended curtains and the family photos in dollar store frames. "He still is, Mama, just not in the way he expected." The next weeks brought a whirlwind of activity. Richardson's team began their assessment of the school district's needs, and the numbers were staggering. It wasn't just about outdated equipment and materials. There were structural issues, staffing gaps, program deficiencies. But rather than deter Richardson, these discoveries seemed to fuel his commitment. He began spending time at Marcus's school, watching how students and teachers worked around limitations. He saw what Marcus had seen, not a failing system, but one filled with potential just waiting to be unlocked. The media attention intensified. Local news stations ran features about the hero student who asked for more. National education advocates began reaching out. Marcus found himself thrust into a spotlight he hadn't sought, but he handled it with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. As spring mellowed into summer, the true complexity of Marcus's request began to unfold. The initial media excitement had subsided, but the real work was just beginning. Richardson Global Investments had assembled a task force of education experts, community leaders, and business professionals to develop a comprehensive plan for the school district. What no one had anticipated was Sophie's growing involvement. Initially, her father had been hesitant about her visits to Marcus's school, viewing them through the lens of security concerns. But Sophie proved surprisingly persistent. "Dad," she'd argued one evening, "if it's safe enough for you to spend time there working on the initiative, why isn't it safe enough for me to learn from it?" Her first visit to Washington High School was a study in contrasts. The security team that accompanied her drew stares, but not as many as her obvious discomfort with the metal detectors and armed resource officers, everyday realities for the other students. Yet, something about the experience captivated her. She found Marcus in the library during lunch, surrounded by younger students he was tutoring in mathematics. Without fanfare or fuss, he simply scooted over to make room for her at the table. "Does anyone need help with French?" she offered quietly. A tiny girl with braids and worn shoes raised her hand hesitantly. Thus began what the local paper would later call the Cross-Cultural Education Initiative, though the students involved simply called it Lunch Club. What started as Sophie helping with French gradually expanded. Other Oakwood Academy students, intrigued by Sophie's stories, began joining them. Soon, the library at lunch became a place where boundaries of class and privilege began to blur in the face of shared learning. Meanwhile, the adult world was grappling with its own challenges. Richardson's announcement of the adoption program had sent ripples through Atlanta's business community. Some praised it as visionary corporate social responsibility. Others, including several board members, questioned the scale of the investment. "Tom," one board member said during a tense meeting, "no one's questioning the feel-good aspects of this, but we're talking about an unprecedented commitment of resources. Our shareholders," Richardson interrupted, "invest in this company because we see opportunities others miss. He pulled up a presentation on the screen. Let me show you the real numbers. The presentation laid out a comprehensive analysis: the untapped talent pool in underserved communities, the cost of educational inequality to the economy, the potential return on investment from developing local talent. But it was the final slide that silenced the room. A security camera still of Marcus diving into the lake to save Sophie. That boy, Richardson said quietly, didn't know who my daughter was. He didn't stop to calculate the risk or potential reward. He saw someone in need and acted. Tell me that's not exactly the kind of character we want to invest in. Back at Washington High, changes were beginning to manifest. The first wave of new computers arrived, along with training for teachers and students. The science lab received a complete overhaul, with Miss Rodriguez crying openly when she saw the new equipment. But it wasn't just about material resources. Marcus found himself increasingly involved in the planning discussions, his perspective valued by the professional team Richardson had assembled. He observed how Sophie's presence was changing perceptions on both sides. His classmates seeing her move past her privilege to genuine friendship, and Sophie understanding realities she'd never had to face before. One incident particularly stood out. During a joint study session, a freshman from Washington High became frustrated with a math problem and burst out, "Easy for you to say. You go to Oakwood. Everything's easy for you." Sophie, rather than taking offense, replied quietly, "You're right. I have advantages. But that doesn't mean I can't want those advantages for everyone. That's why we're here, isn't it?" The moment passed quickly, but Marcus noted how it rippled through the group, shifting perspectives ever so slightly. It was these small changes, he realized, that would ultimately matter as much as the grand initiatives. The summer brought new dimensions to the transformation underway. Richardson Global Investments launched its first summer innovation camp, bringing together students from Washington High, Oakwood Academy, and other schools across the district. The program was housed in the company's state-of-the-art training facility, deliberately mixing students from different backgrounds into project teams. Marcus and Sophie found themselves co-leading one of these teams, their different perspectives and experiences creating a unique dynamic. Sophie brought her multilingual skills and global awareness, while Marcus contributed his practical problem-solving abilities and natural leadership. Their team's project focused on developing a mobile app to connect community resources with student needs, something that had grown out of Marcus's observations about how many of his classmates lacked basic school supplies or access to tutoring. "It's not enough to just provide things," he explained during a planning session. "We need to make sure people know what's available and how to access it." Sophie, who had been sketching interface designs, looked up thoughtfully. "That's what I've been learning from you, the difference between helping from above and helping from within." Their friendship deepened through the shared work, moving beyond the dramatic circumstances of their first meeting. They discovered a shared love of science fiction, leading to lengthy discussions about possible futures and how to make them reality. Sophie began joining Marcus's family for dinner sometimes, sitting at their small kitchen table and learning to love Gloria's cooking. Thomas Richardson watched these developments with mixed emotions. He saw the positive changes in his daughter, her growing social awareness, her deepening understanding of privilege and responsibility. But he also worried about the complications of their growing closeness. One evening, he found Sophie in his home office, studying the framed photos on his wall. "Dad," she said without turning around, "why aren't there any pictures of you from before you were rich?" The question caught him off guard. I suppose I never thought to display them." "Marcus's mom has pictures everywhere," Sophie continued. "Even the old faded ones. She says every part of your story matters." Richardson looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw how much she'd changed since that morning at the lake. The entitled child was giving way to a thoughtful young woman, one who asked uncomfortable but important questions. "Would you like to see those pictures?" he offered. "I have them in storage." That night, father and daughter sat on the floor of his office, going through old photos of a younger, poorer Thomas Richardson. Sophie listened intently, as he spoke about his own journey, about the teachers who had believed in him, about the opportunities that had changed his life. "That's why Marcus's request hit home, isn't it?" Sophie asked. "Because you remember what it's like to need those chances." Richardson pulled his daughter close. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we need someone to remind us of where we came from to see clearly where we should be going." Meanwhile, at the Johnson apartment, Marcus and his mother were having their own conversation about changes and choices. Gloria had recently been offered a promotion at work, a direct result of her supervisor noticing her college coursework and determination. "Things are changing so fast," she said, folding laundry with the precision she brought to everything. "Sometimes it scares me a little." Marcus helped her match socks, a chore they'd done together since he was small. "Good scared or bad scared?" "Both, maybe." She smiled at him, "But mostly good. You know why?" "Why?" "Because you're changing things the right way. Not just taking what's offered, but thinking about how to make things better for everyone." She paused, holding up one of his old t-shirts. "Though I wouldn't say no if Mr. Richardson offered to buy you some new clothes." They laughed together, the sound carrying through their small apartment. Derek, doing homework at the kitchen table, looked up and smiled. He'd been quieter lately, watching all the changes with a child's careful attention. "Marcus," he called out, Do you think I could come to the innovation camp sometime? Just to see?" Marcus and Gloria exchanged glances. In that moment, they both recognized another ripple effect of the changes underway, the expanding horizon of possibilities for their family's youngest member. The school board meeting that would determine the fate of the Richardson Initiative, as it had come to be called, was scheduled for the last week of summer. The auditorium at the district headquarters was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms. Marcus sat between his mother and Sophie in the front row, acutely aware of the tension in the room. The past months had built to this moment, the vote that would either cement the changes they'd begun or bring them to a halt. On paper, it should have been simple. Richardson Global Investments was offering an unprecedented investment in public education. State-of-the-art facilities, teacher training programs, technology integration, and college preparatory resources. But the reality was far more complex. Opposition had emerged from unexpected quarters. Some worried about corporate influence in public education. Others raised concerns about equity. Why these schools and not others? A vocal minority saw it as a publicity stunt, a billionaire's attempt to polish his image after his daughter's near tragedy. The board members sat stoically as speakers took turns at the podium. Corporate representatives outlined the proposal's financial details. Education experts presented research on similar programs. Community leaders spoke about needs and opportunities. Then came the surprise that would change everything. A group of students from both Washington High and Oakwood Academy approached the podium together. They hadn't been on the agenda, but the board chair, seeing something in their determined faces, nodded permission. Sophie stepped forward first, her voice clear in the hushed room. "Everyone keeps talking about what this program means for the future, but we're living its effects right now." She gestured to her classmates. "We've learned more from each other in the past few months than we have from any textbook." One by one, students shared their experiences from the summer program. A Washington High junior described discovering his talent for coding when he finally had access to proper equipment. An Oakwood senior admitted how her assumptions about underprivileged schools had been completely upended. Marcus hadn't planned to speak. But as murmurs of dismissal began from some board members, suggestions that the students had been coached or coerced, he found himself walking to the podium. The room fell silent. "I know some of you think this is about charity," he began, his voice gaining strength, "or about a rich man's guilt or a poor kid's gratitude. But it's not. It's about justice. It's about recognizing that talent and potential exist everywhere, but opportunity doesn't." He looked directly at the board members. "You've seen the presentations about return on investment and economic impact. But let me tell you what I've seen. I've seen students who never thought about college now planning their applications. I've seen teachers crying because they finally have the tools they need to really teach. I've seen kids from different worlds discover they're not so different after all." His voice softened slightly. "The day I jumped into that lake, I didn't think about who I was saving or what I might get out of it. I just knew someone needed help, and I could help. Now we're all standing at the edge of another lake. We can either walk away and say it's too complicated, too expensive, too risky, or we can jump in and help." The silence that followed was profound. Thomas Richardson, watching from his seat, saw board members exchanging glances. He recognized the moment when minds began to shift, not because of the financial projections or expert testimonials, but because of the simple, powerful truth in a 15-year-old's words. The board's deliberation lasted well into the night. As they debated behind closed doors, the waiting crowd in the auditorium began to thin. But Marcus, his family, Sophie, and a core group of students and teachers stayed, their presence a quiet testament to what was at stake. Around midnight, the doors opened. The board chair looked exhausted but resolute as she approached the podium. "We have reached a decision," she announced to the remaining attendees. "The Richardson Initiative will proceed with certain modifications." The modifications, as they were outlined, actually strengthened the program's scope. The board had decided to phase in similar programs across other districts over time, using the initial schools as pilot sites. They'd also added requirements for regular community input and oversight, ensuring the program would remain responsive to local needs. But implementation proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The first major hurdle came from an unexpected source. A group of Oakwood Academy parents threatened to withdraw their children and their financial support if the mixing of schools continued. Sophie found herself at the center of this controversy. At a tense Oakwood Parents Association meeting, she stood before her classmates' parents, many of whom she'd known all her life. "You're afraid we'll be disadvantaged by this program," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger. "But the only disadvantage I see is the one we create by closing ourselves off from different perspectives and experiences." She paused, gathering courage. "The day Marcus jumped into that lake to save me, he didn't see a rich girl or a poor boy. He saw another human being who needed help. Isn't that what we should all see?" The room erupted in heated discussion, but something had shifted. One parent, then another, began to speak up in support. By the end of the meeting, what had started as opposition had transformed into a committee to support and expand the integration efforts. Meanwhile, at Washington High, different challenges emerged. Some students and teachers worried that their school's identity would be lost in the transformation. Others feared that only the highest-achieving students would benefit from the new opportunities. Marcus addressed these concerns during a school assembly, standing before his peers with the quiet confidence he'd developed over the months. "This isn't about becoming Oakwood," he explained. "It's about becoming the best version of ourselves. Every single person in this room deserves access to good equipment, up-to-date books, and real opportunities. And every single person in this room has something valuable to teach others, including our new friends from across town." The true turning point came not from any grand gesture or public event, but from a series of small, powerful moments that accumulated over time. It happened when a Washington High student taught an Oakwood student about resilience during a joint study session, sharing techniques for focusing on homework despite a chaotic home life. It happened when Oakwood students organized a fundraiser for the community center where Marcus had learned to swim, ensuring other children would have the same opportunity that had ultimately saved Sophie's life. It happened when Thomas Richardson walked into the renovated Washington High computer lab one afternoon and found his daughter tutoring a freshman in French while simultaneously learning about coding from another student. But perhaps most significantly, it happened during a joint presentation where Marcus and Sophie shared their mobile app project with potential investors. The app, designed to connect community resources with student needs, had evolved into something more sophisticated than anyone had expected. The most important feature, Marcus explained to the gathered executives, is that it works both ways. It's not just about receiving help, it's about being able to offer help too. Everyone has something to contribute. Thomas Richardson, watching from the back of the room, felt something shift in his understanding of what they'd created. This wasn't just about lifting up one community. It was about building bridges between communities, creating connections that would outlast any single program or initiative. A year after the lake incident, Marcus stood on the stage at Washington High's first Technology and Innovation Fair. The school's gymnasium had been transformed into a showcase of student projects, with representatives from major tech companies and universities moving from display to display. He watched as Sophie demonstrated their app to a group of venture capitalists, her explanation seamlessly incorporating suggestions from Washington High students about real-world needs and applications. She'd grown from a privileged bystander into a passionate advocate, using her position and voice to open doors for others. Nearby, Derek was proudly showing off the robot he'd built in the new engineering lab, his face glowing with the confidence that came from discovering his own capabilities. Gloria, taking a rare day off from both work and studies, moved through the crowd in a new suit, her recent promotion to administrative supervisor finally allowing for such purchases. Thomas Richardson approached Marcus as the event wound down. "I've been thinking about that day at the lake," he said quietly, "about how quick decisions can change everything." Marcus nodded, understanding the multiple layers of meaning in those words. "But what I've learned this year," Richardson continued, "is that it's the slow decisions, the daily choices to keep moving forward, that really transform things." He looked around the gymnasium. "You could have asked for anything that day in my office. Instead, you asked for a chance to change your whole community." "Not just my community anymore," Marcus replied, watching as students from both schools worked together to clean up the exhibits. "Our community now." The story that began with a boy diving into a cold lake to save a stranger had transformed into something far more profound, a testament to the power of seeing beyond immediate circumstances to greater possibilities. The local papers still sometimes referred to Marcus as the hero of Piedmont Park, but the true heroism lay in what came after. The courage to ask for more than personal gain, the wisdom to build bridges instead of walls, the patience to nurture slow, lasting change. Sophie had once asked Marcus if he ever regretted not asking for something for himself that day in her father's office. His response captured the essence of everything that had developed. "But I did ask for something for myself. I asked for a chance to be part of making things better. There's no greater gift than that." The ripples from that cold spring morning continued to spread, touching lives far beyond the initial splash. In boardrooms and classrooms, in community centers and corporate offices, people began to understand that true change comes not from single dramatic moments, but from the daily choice to see beyond barriers, to reach across divides, and to believe in possibilities. For in the end, the greatest acts of heroism often lie not in dramatic rescues, but in the quiet, persistent courage to imagine and work toward a better world. One relationship, one opportunity, one bridge at a time. The story of Marcus and Sophie, of Washington High and Oakwood Academy, of Thomas Richardson's investment and a community's transformation, became more than a tale of rescue and reward. It became a blueprint for how change can happen when people choose to dive into the challenging waters of social transformation, guided by the belief that everyone deserves a chance to reach their full potential. And somewhere in Atlanta, a lake still reflects the sky, its waters holding the memory of a moment when barriers broke and possibilities emerged, a moment that continues to ripple outward, touching lives and changing futures in ways that even Marcus, with all his quiet wisdom, could never have imagined.